Captain Marcus Blackwood had served the Royal Guard of Valdoria for 15 years, his spotless record earning him a position among the elite protectors of the royal family. The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble corridors of Valdoria Palace as he made his routine rounds, his polished boots clicking against the ancient stones that had witnessed centuries of royal history. The kingdom of Valdoria had been experiencing troubled times. King Edmund's recent illness had left much of the daily governance in the hands of Queen Isabel, a woman whose ambition often overshadowed her compassion. The common people whispered of her harsh policies and growing cruelty, but within the palace walls, such talk was strictly forbidden. Marcus paused outside the grand hall where the morning court session was about to begin. Through the ornate doors, he could hear the Queen's sharp voice addressing someone. As the captain of the inner guard, he was privy to many royal conversations, but lately, what he witnessed troubled his conscience more each day. Prince Alexander, the heir to the throne at merely 8 years old, had been showing signs of distress. The boy, once cheerful and bright, now flinched at sudden movements and rarely smiled. Palace servants whispered among themselves, but fear of the Queen's wrath kept them silent. Marcus had noticed bruises on the young prince's arms during sword training sessions, explained away as childhood accidents by the royal physician. The heavy doors swung open, and Marcus stepped inside to take his position. The throne room was magnificent, with towering columns adorned with gold leaf and tapestries depicting Valdoria's glorious past. Queen Isabel sat upon her throne, her emerald dress flowing like a dark river around her feet. Her crown, encrusted with precious stones, caught the light streaming through stained glass windows. Young Prince Alexander stood before his stepmother, his small frame trembling slightly. He had apparently spilled ink on an important document while practicing his letters. The Queen's eyes blazed with fury as she rose from her throne, her voice echoing through the chamber. "You worthless child," she hissed, her words cutting through the air like a blade. "Your father spoiled you rotten, and now look what you've become. A clumsy, useless burden on this crown." Marcus tightened his grip on his ceremonial rifle, the ornate weapon that symbolized his sworn duty to protect the royal family. But who was he meant to protect when the threat came from within? The Queen's verbal assault continued, each word more vicious than the last, designed to break the spirit of a child who should have been playing with wooden toys instead of bearing the weight of royal expectations. The prince began to cry, soft sobs that seemed to echo off the stone walls. Rather than showing mercy, Queen Isabel's anger intensified. She descended the steps of her throne like a predator approaching its prey, her face twisted with rage. "Stop that pathetic whimpering," she commanded. "A future king does not cry like a common peasant child." But Prince Alexander could not stop his tears. The accumulated stress, fear, and confusion of recent months poured out of him in heartbreaking waves. Marcus watched as the Queen raised her jeweled hand, the same hand that had signed death warrants and cruel edicts, preparing to strike the defenseless child. Time seemed to slow as Marcus processed what he was witnessing. His duty was clear according to royal protocol. He was to remain silent and observe, never interfering in royal discipline. The code of the royal guard was absolute: loyalty to the crown above all else, silence in the face of royal conduct, and unwavering service regardless of personal feelings. But as he watched Queen Isabel's hand arc through the air toward the crying prince, another code stirred within him, the moral code that had guided him since childhood, the principles his father had taught him about protecting the innocent and standing against injustice, even when it came at great personal cost. The sharp crack of the Queen's hand connecting with Prince Alexander's face echoed through the chamber like thunder. The boy stumbled backward, his small hand moving to his reddened cheek, fresh tears streaming down his face. The few courtiers present averted their eyes, too frightened to speak or act. Marcus felt something break inside him, not just his heart, but his faith in the institution he had served so faithfully. This was not justice. This was not the noble protection of the realm that he had sworn to uphold. This was the abuse of power in its most disgusting form, and he could no longer stand by and watch. His hands moved almost without conscious thought, the weight of his rifle feeling different somehow. No longer a symbol of honor, but a reminder of his complicity in the suffering of an innocent child. The ornate weapon passed down through generations of royal guards suddenly felt like a chain binding him to a corrupt system. The queen turned to address the cowering courtiers, her voice dripping with satisfaction. "Let this be a lesson to all," she declared. "Weakness will not be tolerated in this palace, not from anyone, regardless of their bloodline." Prince Alexander remained where he had fallen, his small body shaking with silent sobs. No one moved to comfort him. No one dared to challenge the queen's actions. The magnificent throne room, once a symbol of justice and noble rule, had become a chamber of cruelty and fear. Marcus felt the weight of generations of honorable service pressing down upon him. His grandfather had served King Edmund's father with distinction. His own father had died protecting the royal family during a border conflict. The Blackwood name was synonymous with loyal service to the crown of Valdoria. But what was loyalty when it meant enabling the abuse of a child? What was honor when it required silence in the face of injustice? These questions crashed through his mind as he watched the queen return to her throne, completely satisfied with her cruelty. As the court session continued with mundane matters of state, Marcus found himself studying the faces around him. The scribes kept their eyes down, scratching away at their parchments. The advisors whispered among themselves but said nothing about what they had witnessed. The other guards maintained their stoic expressions, trained to see and hear nothing that might complicate their service. But Marcus could no longer unsee what he had witnessed. The image of Prince Alexander's terrified face, the sound of the queen's hand striking flesh, the complete lack of mercy or justice in the act, these things had awakened something in him that could not be put back to sleep. The young prince eventually composed himself enough to stand, though he remained where the queen had struck him down, unwilling to move without permission. His eyes, once bright with the wonder of childhood, now held the hollow look of someone who had learned that the world was not safe, that those meant to protect him could also be his greatest threat. As the morning session drew to a close, Marcus realized that he stood at a crossroads. He could continue to serve as he always had, following orders without question, maintaining the silence that kept the palace functioning. Or he could choose a different path, one that might cost him everything but would allow him to look at himself in the mirror without shame. The queen dismissed the court with a wave of her hand, and the assembled courtiers filed out in hushed whispers. Prince Alexander was left standing alone in the vast chamber, still touching his injured cheek, waiting for permission to leave. Marcus watched as the boy finally received a curt nod from his stepmother and hurried toward the doors on unsteady legs. Their eyes met for just a moment as the prince passed by, and Marcus saw something in that gaze that would haunt him forever. A plea for help from someone too young to understand that help might never come. That night, alone in his quarters, Marcus sat polishing his rifle as he had done countless times before. But tonight, the ritual felt different. Each stroke of the cloth seemed to be preparing the weapon for something other than ceremony. He thought about his oath of service, about the meaning of true protection, and about what it really meant to serve justice rather than simply serving power. The weight of his decision pressed down upon him as he contemplated the consequences of the choice that lay before him. To act would mean the end of his career, the disgrace of his family name, and quite possibly his death. To remain silent would mean becoming complicit in the continued abuse of an innocent child who depended on adults to keep him safe. As dawn approached, Marcus Blackwood knew that he could no longer serve two masters. He would have to choose between his loyalty to the crown and his loyalty to his conscience, between the comfort of obedience and the dangerous path of moral courage. The next morning would bring another court session, another opportunity for the queen to display her cruelty, another moment when someone would need to decide whether protecting a child was worth risking everything they had ever known. The second day dawned gray and cold over Valdoria Palace, matching the heaviness that had settled in Captain Marcus Blackwood's heart. He had barely slept, his mind churning over the events of the previous day and the impossible choice that lay before him. The familiar weight of his ceremonial rifle felt different as he strapped it across his back, no longer a symbol of honor, but a reminder of his moral crisis. Prince Alexander appeared at the morning court session looking even more fragile than before. The mark from Queen Isabel's strike had darkened into a clear bruise on his small face, impossible to ignore despite the royal physician's attempts to conceal it with powder. The boy moved carefully, as if afraid that any sudden movement might bring down fresh punishment upon his head. Marcus took his position along the wall, his trained eyes scanning the room for threats. But today, the greatest threat to the person he was sworn to protect sat upon the very throne he was meant to defend. Queen Isabel held court with her usual imperious manner, dealing with petitioners and state business with cold efficiency. The morning proceeded normally until a merchant approached the throne with a complaint about unfair taxation in his district. He was an older man, weathered by years of hard work, his clothes clean but clearly mended multiple times. He spoke respectfully but firmly about the hardship the new taxes were causing his family and neighbors. Queen Isabel listened with growing irritation, her fingers drumming against the armrest of her throne. When the merchant finished his plea, she leaned forward with a predatory smile. "You dare question the wisdom of your queen?" she asked, her voice dangerously quiet. "Perhaps you need a reminder of what happens to those who challenge the crown's authority." She gestured to the guards, and Marcus watched in horror as two of his fellow guards stepped forward to seize the merchant. The man's eyes widened in fear as he realized his mistake. He had expected justice, but found only tyranny. "Take him to the dungeons," the queen commanded. "Let him think about his impudence in chains." "Your Majesty," the merchant pleaded, "I have a family, children who depend on me. I meant no disrespect, I only sought fair treatment for my people." The queen's laughter was like breaking glass. "Then perhaps your family will learn from your example. Guards, see that his property is seized to pay for his insolence." Marcus felt his hands clench involuntarily. This was not justice. This was the arbitrary cruelty of absolute power corrupted. The merchant's crime was nothing more than speaking truth to power, asking for the basic fairness that should be the foundation of any just kingdom. But it was what happened next that finally shattered Marcus's resolve to remain silent. Young Prince Alexander, witnessing the merchant's distress, stepped forward with the innocent courage that only children possess. His voice was small but clear as it carried across the throne room. "Please, Your Majesty," he said, his words carefully pronounced despite his youth. "The man has children like me. Could we not show mercy?" The silence that followed was deafening. Every person in the room held their breath, knowing they were witnessing a moment that could not be taken back. The queen's face transformed into a mask of pure rage, her carefully maintained composure cracking like ice under pressure. She rose from her throne slowly, deliberately, her eyes fixed on the young prince with a fury that made the previous day's anger seem mild by comparison. Prince Alexander, realizing he had made a terrible mistake, began to back away. But there was nowhere to go in the vast open chamber. "You pathetic mewling child," the queen hissed, advancing on the prince like a serpent preparing to strike. "How dare you question my judgment? How dare you show such weakness in front of my subjects?" The prince began to cry again, but this time his tears seemed to fuel the queen's rage rather than simply irritate her. She grabbed the boy by his arm, her fingers digging into his flesh with enough force to leave new bruises. "I have tolerated your sniveling long enough," she snarled. "You are a disgrace to the crown, to your bloodline, and to this kingdom. Perhaps it is time you learned what real consequences feel like." With that, she struck him again, harder this time, sending the small boy stumbling backward. But she did not stop there, as Prince Alexander fell to his knees, crying out in pain and fear. Queen Isabel raised her hand to strike again. It was in that moment that something fundamental shifted inside Captain Marcus Blackwood. Years of military training, of following orders without question, of putting duty above personal feelings, all of it crumbled in the face of what he was witnessing. This was not duty. This was not honor. This was the strong preying upon the weak, power without restraint or conscience. The sound of his rifle hitting the marble floor echoed through the throne room like a thunderclap. Every head turned toward Marcus as the ornate weapon clattered across the stone, its ceremonial decorations catching the light as it spun to a stop. The captain stood at attention, his back straight, his eyes fixed on the queen with an expression of barely controlled fury. "I will not stand guard while you abuse a child," he declared, his voice carrying the authority of his years of service and the moral conviction of his choice. "I will not be complicit in this cruelty." The queen stared at him in shock, momentarily speechless at this unprecedented act of defiance. The other guards looked between Marcus and their queen, Uncertain how to respond to such an extraordinary breach of protocol, the courtiers pressed themselves against the walls, desperate to avoid being caught in what was clearly about to become a dangerous confrontation. "Captain Blackwood," the Queen said slowly, her voice deadly quiet, "pick up your weapon and return to your position immediately, or face the consequences of treason." Marcus did not move. He looked down at Prince Alexander, who was staring up at him with wonder and hope, perhaps the first adult who had ever stood up for him against his stepmother's cruelty. The boy's face was streaked with tears, his small body trembling with fear, but his eyes held a spark of something that had been missing for too long. The belief that someone cared enough to protect him. "My duty is to protect the royal family," Marcus replied, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was doing. "That includes protecting Prince Alexander from those who would harm him, regardless of their position." The throne room erupted in gasps and whispered exclamations. Never in the history of Valdoria had a member of the royal guard openly defied the monarch. The precedent Marcus was setting was dangerous, revolutionary, and completely unprecedented. Queen Isabel's face contorted with rage beyond anything she had displayed before. "Seize him," she commanded the other guards. "Arrest this traitor immediately." But the other guards hesitated. Marcus Blackwood was not just their captain. He was respected throughout the ranks as a man of honor and integrity. His service record was impeccable, his loyalty to the kingdom unquestioned until this moment. If someone like Marcus was willing to throw away his career and risk his life to make this stand, perhaps there was more truth in his actions than in the Queen's commands. "I said seize him." The Queen screamed again, but still the guards hesitated. Marcus stepped forward, placing himself between the Queen and Prince Alexander. "Your Majesty," he said formally, "I have served this crown faithfully for 15 years. I have bled for this kingdom, lost friends defending its borders, and upheld its laws without question. But I will not stand by while an innocent child suffers abuse." He knelt down beside Prince Alexander, his voice gentle as he addressed the frightened boy. "Your Highness, you are brave and kind, and no one has the right to hurt you. Remember that, no matter what happens next." The prince nodded through his tears, reaching out to grasp Marcus's hand with desperate gratitude. In that simple gesture, the captain knew that he had made the right choice, regardless of the consequences that awaited him. Queen Isabel, seeing that her own guards were unwilling to act against Marcus, began to pace like a caged animal. "You have no idea what you have done," she snarled. "You have committed treason against the crown. The penalty for such an act is death." "Then so be it," Marcus replied, rising to face her. "I would rather die with honor than live as a coward who enabled the abuse of a child." The merchant, still held by the two guards, watched the scene unfold with amazement. Here was a man willing to sacrifice everything for the sake of justice, something the merchant had thought no longer existed in Valdoria. Other courtiers began to whisper among themselves, some beginning to question whether they too had been complicit in injustice through their silence. The Queen realized that Marcus's act of defiance was more dangerous than simple insubordination. It was inspiring others to question her authority, to consider whether following orders was always the right course of action. If this rebellion spread, her grip on power could be seriously threatened. "Guards," she commanded once more, her voice shrill with desperation. "If you do not arrest Captain Blackwood immediately, you will all be charged with conspiracy and treason." This threat finally spurred the guards to action, but their movements were reluctant, uncertain. They approached Marcus slowly, as if hoping he might change his mind and save them all from this impossible situation. Marcus looked at his fellow guards with understanding rather than anger. "I do not blame you for following orders," he told them, "but I pray that someday you will find the courage to follow your conscience instead." As the guards reached for him, Marcus did not resist. He had made his statement, taken his stand, and now he would face the consequences with the same dignity that had marked his years of service. But as they led him away, he noticed something that gave him hope. Several of the guards avoided meeting the Queen's eyes, their faces troubled by what they had witnessed. Prince Alexander watched in horror as the one person who had stood up for him was taken away. The boy's cries echoed through the throne room as Marcus was led toward the dungeons, but this time, instead of showing annoyance at the child's tears, several courtiers looked moved by his distress. Queen Isabel had won this battle, but Marcus's act of defiance had planted seeds of doubt and conscience that would be much harder to root out than a single rebellious guard. The queen resumed her throne, trying to project an image of control and authority, but the damage had been done. The merchant was released quietly. Later that day, the charges against him mysteriously dropped. Word of what had happened in the throne room began to spread throughout the palace and beyond, carried by servants and courtiers who could no longer keep such events secret. That evening, as Marcus sat in his cell awaiting whatever judgment the queen might pronounce, he reflected on the choice he had made. His career was over, his life likely forfeit, and his family name would forever be associated with treason against the crown. But when he closed his eyes, he saw Prince Alexander's face filled with gratitude and hope, and he knew that some prices were worth paying. The question now was whether anyone else would find the courage to follow his example, or whether his sacrifice would be remembered only as the foolish gesture of a single man who chose conscience over career. The answer would determine not just his own fate, but the future of justice in the kingdom of Valdoria. The dungeons beneath Valdoria Palace were cold and damp, carved from ancient stone that seemed to absorb hope itself. Captain Marcus Blackwood sat on the rough bench in his cell, his uniform stripped away and replaced with coarse prisoner's garb. The ornate rifle that had symbolized his years of faithful service lay somewhere above, abandoned on the marble floor, where his act of defiance had begun. 3 days had passed since his arrest, and the palace had been unusually quiet. No trial had been scheduled, no formal charges announced. Queen Isabel seemed content to let him rot in uncertainty, perhaps hoping that the delay would break his spirit and convince him to beg for mercy. But Marcus felt no regret for his actions. Each time he closed his eyes, he saw Prince Alexander's bruised face and remembered the grateful squeeze of the boy's small hand. Whatever happened to him now, he had finally acted according to his conscience rather than his orders. On the fourth morning, footsteps echoed through the dungeon corridors. Marcus expected to see guards coming to escort him to his execution, but instead, a familiar figure appeared at his cell bars. Sergeant William Cross had served under Marcus for 7 years and was one of the most trusted members of the Royal Guard. "Captain," Cross said quietly, glancing around to ensure they were alone, "I've brought you some better food and clean water." Marcus accepted the offered items gratefully but studied his subordinate's troubled expression. "You look like a man with something weighing on his conscience, Sergeant." Cross shifted uncomfortably, his hand unconsciously moving to rest on his rifle. "What you did in the throne room, it's got the whole guard talking. Some say you were right to stand up for the prince. Others say you betrayed your oath." "And what do you say?" Marcus asked gently. The sergeant was quiet for a long moment, staring at the stone floor. "I say I've seen things over the years that made my stomach turn, but I always told myself it wasn't my place to interfere, that following orders was enough, even when those orders meant looking the other way while wrong was being done." He looked up at Marcus with tormented eyes. "But watching you drop your rifle and stand up for that boy, it made me realize that sometimes following orders isn't enough. Sometimes staying silent makes you part of the problem." Marcus nodded, understanding. "That realization comes at a price, Sergeant. Are you prepared to pay it?" Before Cross could answer, more footsteps approached. He quickly stepped back from the cell as 2 other guards appeared, their faces masks of professional neutrality. But Marcus caught something in their eyes, a flicker of doubt, a questioning that hadn't been there before his arrest. "The Queen wants to see the prisoner," one of them announced. As they escorted Marcus through the palace corridors, he noticed subtle changes in the atmosphere. Servants who once moved with brisk efficiency now seemed nervous, their conversations stopping abruptly when guards passed by. Courtiers gathered in small groups, their voices hushed but their discussions clearly intense. The throne room felt different when Marcus was brought before Queen Isabel. The magnificent chamber that had once inspired awe now seemed oppressive, its grandeur tainted by the cruelty it had witnessed. The queen sat rigidly on her throne, her face a mask of controlled fury. Prince Alexander was nowhere to be seen. "Captain Blackwood," the queen began, her voice dripping with false sweetness, "I've decided to offer you one final chance to redeem yourself." Marcus stood straight, meeting her gaze without flinching. "Your Majesty, kneel before your queen," she commanded. "Apologize for your treasonous behavior, Swear renewed loyalty to the crown, and I might consider showing mercy. The assembled courtiers watched with bated breath, wondering if the captain, who had shocked them all with his defiance, would now surrender to save his life. Marcus looked around the room, seeing the faces of people he had protected for years, people who had witnessed injustice but chosen silence over courage. "I kneel only before God and justice," Marcus replied firmly. "I will not apologize for protecting an innocent child from abuse." Queen Isabel's mask of composure cracked slightly. "You forget your place, Captain. You swore an oath to serve the crown without question." "I swore an oath to protect the royal family," Marcus corrected. "Prince Alexander is part of that family, and he deserves protection from all threats, including those that come from within these very walls." A murmur rippled through the assembled courtiers. Such direct defiance of the Queen's authority was unprecedented, and Marcus's words carried uncomfortable implications for everyone who had witnessed the abuse and done nothing. The Queen rose from her throne, her face flushed with anger. "You dare imply that I am a threat to my own stepson? You accuse your queen of wrongdoing." "I accuse no one," Marcus replied calmly. "I simply state what I have observed with my own eyes. A child has been hurt, and those responsible must be held accountable, regardless of their position." Lord Chancellor Edmund Hartwell, an elderly man who had served the royal family for decades, stepped forward hesitantly. "Your Majesty, perhaps we should consider the captain's perspective. The prince has seemed troubled lately and—" "Silence," the Queen snapped. "I will not have my judgment questioned by traitors and fools." But the seed of doubt had been planted. Other courtiers began to exchange meaningful glances, remembering instances of the prince's distress they had previously attributed to childish sensitivity. Marcus's courage was inspiring others to question what they had previously accepted without thought. "Where is Prince Alexander?" Marcus asked suddenly. "If my accusations are false, surely he would be here to refute them himself." The Queen's eyes flashed dangerously. "The prince is receiving private tutoring, away from the corrupting influence of those who would fill his head with treasonous ideas. Or perhaps," a new voice said from the rear of the throne room, "he is being kept away because the evidence of abuse has become too obvious to hide." Everyone turned in shock to see Sergeant Cross stepping forward, his rifle held at his side rather than in the ceremonial position. Behind him, 3 other guards moved with similar purposefulness, their faces set with grim determination. "Sergeant Cross," the Queen said, her voice deadly quiet, "return to your position immediately." "I cannot do that, Your Majesty," Cross replied. "Not when I know that a child is suffering, and we are the ones meant to protect him." The throne room erupted in confused whispers as more guards began to step forward, abandoning their posts to stand with Cross and Marcus. Not all of them, several remained in position, torn between duty and conscience, but enough to make the Queen's position suddenly precarious. "This is mutiny," she shrieked. "Guards, arrest these traitors immediately." But the guards who remained loyal hesitated, outnumbered by their defecting comrades and clearly uncertain about the righteousness of their cause. The situation had escalated beyond a simple matter of discipline into something approaching revolution. Lord Hartwell raised a trembling hand. "Your Majesty, perhaps we should summon the prince to resolve this matter. If he appears unharmed and speaks freely about his treatment, it would end these misunderstandings." The Queen's face went pale, and Marcus knew that his suspicions were correct. Prince Alexander could not be brought forward because the evidence of abuse would be impossible to hide or explain away. The Queen had been caught in her own cruelty. "The prince is indisposed," she said quickly. "This entire matter is the result of one man's delusions and his ability to corrupt good soldiers with his lies." But her words lacked conviction, and everyone in the room could sense her growing desperation. Marcus stepped forward, flanked by the guards who had chosen to support him. "Then let us go to the prince," he said. "Let us see for ourselves that he is well and happy. Surely that would resolve all doubts about his welfare." The challenge hung in the air like a sword waiting to fall. The Queen found herself trapped between admitting to her abuse of the prince and allowing witnesses to see the evidence of her cruelty. Either choice would destroy her carefully maintained image of righteous authority. "This discussion is over," she declared finally. "All of you who have abandoned your posts are dismissed from service and will face trial for mutiny. Guards, But when she called for the remaining loyal guards to act, they too began to lower their weapons. The tide of opinion in the room had shifted decisively against her, inspired by Marcus's courage and validated by her own inability to produce an unharmed, happy prince. The queen found herself increasingly isolated, surrounded by people who were beginning to see through the facade of power to the cruelty beneath. Her authority, built on fear and submission, was crumbling in the face of moral courage. "Captain Blackwood," Lord Hartwell said formally, "as Lord Chancellor of Valdoria, I hereby request that you escort Her Majesty to secure quarters while we investigate these serious allegations regarding the welfare of Prince Alexander." The irony was not lost on anyone. The man who had been imprisoned for protecting the prince was now being asked to arrest the queen for abusing him. Marcus looked at the woman who had held absolute power just minutes before, now reduced to a cornered and desperate figure. "Your Majesty," he said with professional courtesy, "you will come with us voluntarily, or we will be forced to use restraint." Queen Isabel's final mask fell away, revealing the true face of her character. "You will all regret this," she snarled. "When King Edmund recovers, he will have you all executed for this betrayal." "Perhaps," Marcus replied, "but at least we will die knowing we protected his son when you would not." As the queen was led away under guard, Marcus felt a profound sense of both relief and uncertainty. Justice had been served, but the kingdom now faced an uncertain future. The young prince would need to be found and cared for. The government would need to function without the queen's iron rule, and the precedent of guards choosing conscience over orders would need to be carefully managed. But for now, it was enough that the cycle of abuse had been broken and that courage had triumphed over complicity. The palace staff began to mobilize, searching for Prince Alexander and beginning the complex process of healing a kingdom that had been wounded by the corruption of power. Marcus's act of dropping his rifle had started as one man's protest against injustice. It had grown into a movement that challenged the very foundations of absolute authority and established the principle that even kings and queens must answer for their crimes against the innocent. The real test would come in the days ahead as they attempted to build a more just system from the ruins of the old. But the first most important step had been taken, the decision to stand up for what was right, regardless of the cost. The search for Prince Alexander began immediately after Queen Isabel's arrest. Marcus Blackwood, still wearing the rough prisoner's clothing but now restored to his role as protector, led a team of loyal guards through the palace's countless chambers and corridors. The ornate building that had seemed so familiar during his years of service now revealed hidden passages and secret rooms that spoke to darker purposes. Lord Chancellor Hartwell accompanied the search party, his aged face drawn with worry and guilt. "I should have seen the signs," he muttered as they checked another empty chamber, the boy's increasing withdrawal. The way he flinched when spoken to sharply. "I told myself it was normal adjustment to his father's illness." Marcus examined a locked door in the eastern wing of the palace, a section normally reserved for storage and rarely visited by the main household. "We all saw signs, my lord. The difference is that some of us chose to act on what we saw." Sergeant Cross approached with a ring of keys taken from the Queen's quarters. "Captain, these were hidden in a secret compartment in her desk. Several of them don't match any locks we know about." As they tried various keys, the sound of muffled sobbing reached their ears from behind the locked door. Marcus's heart clenched with a mixture of relief at finding the prince alive and anger at what his condition might reveal. The lock finally clicked open, revealing a small windowless room that had clearly been converted into a makeshift prison. Prince Alexander huddled in the corner on a thin straw mattress, his once fine clothing torn and dirty. Fresh bruises covered his arms and face, and his eyes held the hollow look of someone who had given up hope of rescue. "Alexander," Marcus said softly, kneeling down to the boy's level. "You're safe now. No one is going to hurt you anymore." The prince looked up with confusion and disbelief. "Captain Marcus? But the Queen said you had been executed for treason. She said no one was coming to help me." The cruelty of that lie struck everyone in the room like a physical blow. The Queen had not only abused the child physically, but had broken his spirit by convincing him that his one protector was dead. Lord Hartwell's voice shook with rage. "Your Highness, Captain Blackwood was never executed. He was imprisoned for protecting you, and now we're all here to make sure you're never hurt again." Marcus carefully helped the prince to his feet noting how the boy winced at every movement. "Can you tell us what happened, Alexander? Take your time and remember that you're safe now." Through tears and halting words, Prince Alexander recounted days of confinement, irregular meals, and frequent beatings administered by the Queen whenever her frustration with the kingdom's affairs needed an outlet. The story that emerged painted a picture of systematic abuse designed not just to punish but to break the spirit of a child who represented everything the Queen resented about her position. "She said my father was dying because I was weak," the prince whispered. "She said the kingdom would fall if I ever became king because I was too soft, too kind. She was trying to make me stronger by teaching me that kindness was weakness." The guards who had followed Marcus exchanged grim looks. Several of them had children of their own, and the thought of what the prince had endured filled them with protective fury. But Marcus recognized that anger alone would not heal the damage that had been done. "Your kindness is not weakness, Alexander," Marcus said firmly. "Your compassion for the merchant, your tears for his family, those showed strength of character that your stepmother could never understand. A true king protects those who cannot protect themselves." As they escorted Prince Alexander from his prison, news of his condition spread throughout the palace with remarkable speed. Servants who had whispered suspicions in dark corners now spoke openly of their shame at not acting sooner. Guards who had remained loyal to the Queen during the confrontation in the throne room began to question their choice. Dr. Helena Winters, the court physician who had so often explained away the prince's injuries, appeared at the medical chambers with tears streaming down her face. "Your Highness," she said, bowing deeply before the rescued prince, "I have failed you terribly. I knew what was happening, but I was too afraid to speak the truth." The physician's confession opened floodgates of guilt and revelation throughout the palace. Tutors admitted to being forced to report the prince's every word to the Queen. Kitchen staff revealed how his meals had been deliberately reduced as punishment for perceived infractions. Even Lady Catherine Morse, the prince's governess, came forward to describe how she had been dismissed weeks earlier for trying to protect the boy. "The Queen told me that I was undermining royal discipline," Lady Catherine explained to Lord Hartwell. "She said that Alexander needed firm correction to prepare him for the burden of kingship. When I refused to participate in what I saw as cruelty, she banished me from the palace." As the full scope of the Queen's systematic abuse became clear, support for Marcus's rebellion grew throughout the kingdom. Word spread beyond the palace walls, carried by servants and merchants who could no longer keep such momentous events secret. The captain who had risked everything to protect a child became a symbol of moral courage in a realm that had forgotten the meaning of true justice. But the situation remained precarious. King Edmund lay unconscious in his chambers, struck down by a mysterious illness that had begun shortly after he had started questioning his wife's harsh treatment of his son. The royal physicians could find no clear cause for his condition, leading to whispered suspicions about the Queen's possible involvement in his sickness. "We must consider the possibility that Her Majesty poisoned the king," Dr. Winters confided to Lord Hartwell during a private meeting. "The symptoms are consistent with several toxins that were available in her private chambers." The implications were staggering. If the Queen had not only abused Prince Alexander, but also poisoned King Edmund to maintain her grip on power, then the entire kingdom had been under the rule of a calculating murderer. Marcus found himself in an unexpected position of authority as more guards and nobles rallied to his cause. His act of conscience had revealed the rot at the heart of the kingdom's government, but cleaning up that corruption would require careful planning and broad support. "Captain," Lord Hartwell said during an emergency council meeting, "the nobles are demanding answers. Some support your actions, but others worry about the precedent of guards overthrowing royal authority. We need to proceed carefully to avoid civil war." Marcus understood the delicate balance they needed to maintain. "The goal was never to overthrow the monarchy, my lord. It was to protect an innocent child and restore justice to the kingdom. If we can prove the Queen's crimes and ensure Prince Alexander's safety, perhaps we can heal the wounds her reign has caused." The evidence against Queen Isabel continued to mount as investigators searched her quarters and questioned palace staff. They found vials of suspicious substances, journals detailing her growing resentment of her stepson and husband, and correspondence with foreign agents who had promised her greater power in exchange for strategic information about Valdoria's defenses. But the most damning evidence came from Prince Alexander himself. As he recovered under careful medical supervision, the boy began to speak more freely about his experiences, His testimony revealed not just physical abuse but a systematic campaign of psychological manipulation designed to convince him that he was worthless and unfit to rule. "She made me write letters to my father," the prince told Marcus during one of their daily conversations. "Letters saying that I was grateful for her discipline and that I understood I needed to be punished for my weakness. She said if I didn't write them, she would hurt the servants who had been kind to me." The depth of the queen's cruelty seemed to know no bounds. She had not only abused her stepson but had forced him to participate in his own degradation, creating false evidence that she was a loving stepmother dealing with a difficult child. As the investigation continued, unexpected allies emerged from throughout the kingdom. Noble houses that had grown increasingly uncomfortable with the queen's harsh policies sent representatives expressing support for Marcus's actions. Merchant guilds that had suffered under her arbitrary taxation offered their backing for any effort to restore just governance. Even some members of the Queen's own guard began to come forward with testimonies about orders they had been given that troubled their consciences. Orders to spy on loyal nobles, to intimidate merchants who complained about unfair treatment, and to help conceal evidence of Prince Alexander's abuse. "She told us we were protecting the stability of the kingdom," one guard confessed. "She said that showing weakness would encourage rebellion and that harsh measures were necessary to maintain order. We believed we were serving the greater good." Marcus understood their position better than most. "The line between duty and conscience is not always clear," he told the repentant guards. "What matters is that you're choosing to do the right thing now." The momentum for justice was building, but the kingdom still faced enormous challenges. With the king unconscious and the queen under arrest, questions arose about who held legitimate authority. Some nobles argued for a regency council to govern until Prince Alexander came of age, while others insisted that the queen's crimes invalidated any claim to power. As these debates raged in the noble houses and council chambers, Marcus focused on the most important task, ensuring that Prince Alexander received the care and protection he deserved. The boy was slowly healing both physically and emotionally, but the scars left by his stepmother's cruelty would take years to fade completely. "Do you think my father will get better?" the prince asked during one of their walks through the palace gardens. Marcus chose his words carefully. "I hope so, Alexander. But whatever happens, you have many people who care about you and want to see you grow into the good king I know you can become." The prince nodded thoughtfully. "I want to be the kind of king who protects people like you protected me. I want to make sure no one else suffers the way I did." In that moment, Marcus knew that his sacrifice had been worthwhile. The boy who had been broken by cruelty was finding his way back to the kindness and compassion that would make him a truly great leader. The kingdom's future remained uncertain, but it was built on a foundation of justice rather than fear. The search for truth had revealed not just the queen's crimes, but the capacity for both evil and good that existed within every person. The choice to stand up for justice, even at great personal cost, had inspired others to find their own courage and work toward a better future for all. 6 months after Captain Marcus Blackwood dropped his rifle in defiance of tyranny, the kingdom of Valdoria had transformed beyond recognition. The great hall where Queen Isabel had once dispensed cruel justice now served as a court where truth and mercy guided every decision. Marcus stood at his familiar post, but the weight of his ceremonial rifle felt different now. It was truly a symbol of protection rather than mere obedience. King Edmund had awakened from his mysterious illness 3 weeks after the Queen's arrest. The royal physicians, led by Dr. Winters, had worked tirelessly to purge the slow-acting poison from his system. When consciousness finally returned to the king, his first words were for his son, and his tears upon learning of Alexander's suffering had moved everyone present. "My boy," the king had whispered, embracing Prince Alexander with trembling arms. "I failed you when you needed me most. Can you ever forgive me?" The reunion between father and son had marked the beginning of the kingdom's true healing. King Edmund, weakened by his ordeal but determined to make amends, had thrown himself into the task of reforming the laws and customs that had allowed such abuse to flourish unchecked. Today marked the culmination of those efforts, the formal trial of Queen Isabel for treason, child abuse, attempted murder, and crimes against the kingdom. The proceedings were open to all citizens, a radical departure from the secretive justice that had characterized her reign. Marcus watched as the former queen was led into the hall in chains, her once magnificent bearing reduced to the hunched posture of someone who knew her fate was sealed. She no longer wore royal robes but simple prisoner's garb, and her face showed the toll that months in a proper cell had taken on someone accustomed to luxury and absolute power. Lord Chancellor Hartwell, now serving as chief judge, read the charges in a clear voice that carried to every corner of the packed hall. Citizens who had suffered under the Queen's rule sat alongside nobles who had enabled her cruelty, all united in their desire to see justice finally served. "Isabel of House Corvain," Hartwell intoned, "you stand accused of high treason against the crown, systematic abuse of Prince Alexander, attempted murder of King Edmund through poisoning, corruption of royal authority, and numerous other crimes against the people of Valdoria. How do you answer these charges?" The former queen raised her head with a ghost of her old arrogance. "I answer that I did what was necessary to maintain order in this kingdom. Every action I took was in service to the crown and the stability of the realm." A murmur of anger rippled through the assembled crowd, but King Edmund raised his hand for silence. The monarch looked frailer than before his poisoning, but his eyes burned with quiet determination. "Let her speak," the king said. "Let the record show exactly what kind of person we entrusted with power." Queen Isabel's defense was a chilling testament to the corruption of absolute authority. She spoke of her actions as necessary measures, her cruelty as discipline, her abuse as character building. In her mind, she remained the wronged party, victimized by those too weak to understand the harsh realities of leadership. "The boy was soft," she declared, looking directly at Prince Alexander, who sat beside his father with quiet dignity. "The kingdom needed strength, and I was providing it. If you coddle weakness, you create a monarch who will lead the realm to ruin." Prince Alexander, now 13 and bearing himself with remarkable maturity for his age, stood to respond. The hall fell silent as the young man who had suffered so much prepared to confront his tormentor. "Your Majesty," he said, addressing his stepmother with formal courtesy that demonstrated his nobility of character, "you taught me many things during your reign. You taught me what cruelty looks like when it wears a crown. You taught me that power without compassion is merely tyranny. Most importantly, you taught me that true strength comes from protecting others, not from hurting them." The prince's words carried a wisdom far beyond his years, forged in the crucible of suffering, but refined by the love and support he had received during his recovery. Marcus felt a surge of pride as he watched the boy he had risked everything to protect stand up to his abuser with courage and grace. "The kingdom doesn't need a king who rules through fear," Alexander continued. "It needs a king who serves his people with justice and mercy. Your example has shown me exactly the kind of ruler I never want to become." The courtroom erupted in applause, and even some of the former queen's supporters found themselves moved by the prince's eloquent response. Queen Isabel's face twisted with rage at being lectured by the child she had tried to break, but her chains prevented any physical response. The evidence against the former queen was overwhelming. Witnesses testified to her systematic abuse, physicians presented evidence of the poison in the king's system, and documents from her chambers revealed her treasonous correspondence with foreign enemies. The merchant whose unfair treatment had precipitated Marcus's act of rebellion spoke movingly about the fear that had gripped the common people under her rule. But perhaps the most powerful testimony came from members of the royal guard who had witnessed her cruelty and remained silent. Sergeant Cross, now promoted to captain of the guard in recognition of his eventual courage, spoke for many of his comrades. "We were trained to follow orders without question," he testified. "We told ourselves that our duty was to obey, not to judge." It took Captain Blackwood's example to show us that sometimes the greatest service to the crown means protecting it from its own corruption. When Marcus himself took the stand, he spoke simply and directly about the moment when he had been forced to choose between his orders and his conscience. "I did not drop my rifle in rebellion against the kingdom," he stated clearly. "I dropped it in defense of the kingdom's true values, justice, protection of the innocent, and the belief that no person, regardless of their position, is above moral law." The trial lasted 3 days, with testimony revealing the full scope of the former queen's crimes. When the evidence was complete, the panel of judges retired to deliberate. They returned within hours with a unanimous verdict: guilty on all charges. Lord Hartwell announced. The sentence is death for treason and attempted murder to be carried out in accordance with the laws of Valdoria. Queen Isabel showed no remorse even in defeat. You will regret this, she snarled as the guards moved to escort her away. Weakness will destroy this kingdom, and you will have no one to blame but yourselves. But her words fell on deaf ears. The kingdom had already begun to flourish under a system of justice that balanced strength with compassion, order with mercy. King Edmund rose to address the assembled crowd. Today marks not just the end of a dark chapter in our history, but the beginning of a new era for Valdoria. We have learned that power without accountability leads to tyranny, and that true strength comes from protecting those who cannot protect themselves. He turned to Marcus with a smile of genuine gratitude. Captain Blackwood, your courage in standing up for what was right saved not just my son, but our entire kingdom. You have shown us all what it truly means to serve with honor. Marcus bowed deeply. Your Majesty, I did only what my conscience demanded. The real heroes are those who found the courage to join me, and the people of Valdoria who chose justice over fear. The ceremony that followed transformed the palace that had once echoed with cruelty into a place of celebration and hope. Prince Alexander, his physical and emotional wounds healing with each passing day, spoke to the assembled crowd with the wisdom of someone who had seen both the worst and best of human nature. Today we celebrate justice, he declared, but tomorrow we must work to build a kingdom where such justice is never again necessary. We must create a realm where power serves the people, not the other way around. The reforms that followed were sweeping and permanent. New laws established oversight of royal authority, created protections for those who spoke truth to power, and ensured that the abuse of power would be met with swift consequences. The Royal Guard was reformed with an emphasis on moral courage alongside military discipline. Marcus was offered many honors and positions, but he chose to remain as captain of the prince's personal guard, dedicated to protecting the young man whose character had been forged in suffering, but tempered with wisdom and compassion. Years later, when Prince Alexander ascended to the throne as King Alexander the Just, his first act was to establish a new order of knighthood, the Knights of Conscience, dedicated to those who chose moral courage over convenient obedience. Marcus Blackwood was the first person inducted into this order, his simple act of dropping a rifle in protest having grown into a revolution of the spirit that transformed an entire kingdom. The merchant whose taxation complaint had started the chain of events that led to the Queen's downfall became a trusted advisor on common law, ensuring that the voices of ordinary citizens would always be heard in the halls of power. Dr. Ceresu set Winters-led reforms in medical ethics, establishing that a physician's duty to truth superseded any loyalty to powerful patients. Most importantly, the cycle of abuse that had threatened to destroy the kingdom's future was broken. King Alexander ruled with the compassion his stepmother had tried to beat out of him, proving that kindness was indeed a form of strength, and that justice served with mercy was the foundation of any kingdom worth preserving. The ceremonial rifle that Marcus had dropped in that pivotal moment was preserved in the Palace Museum, not as a symbol of rebellion, but as a reminder that sometimes the greatest service to authority is the courage to say no when authority demands the wrong thing. Beside it hung a simple plaque with the words that had become the kingdom's new motto: "True loyalty serves justice, not power." In the end, the story of Captain Marcus Blackwood and Prince Alexander became more than just a tale of one man's courage and one child's suffering. It became the founding legend of a new kind of kingdom, one built not on fear and submission, but on the revolutionary idea that power must always answer to conscience, and that protecting the innocent is the highest duty of anyone who claims to serve justice. The kingdom of Valdoria prospered under these new principles, becoming a beacon of hope for other realms struggling with the corruption of unchecked authority. And at the heart of this transformation was the simple truth that Marcus had discovered in that moment of crisis. Sometimes the most important thing a guard can do is know when to lay down his weapon in the service of a higher law.